What if I told you that the very thing you believed made you average was actually the exact force that made you unforgettable? You were not chosen because you tried harder, nor because you transformed yourself into someone else, but because in a quiet and almost unconscious way, you stopped acting. And in that instant, something ancient within the human psyche awakened. You did not chase, you revealed. You did not persuade, you embodied. And that, as frighteningly simple as it sounds, is what pulled them closer. Sit with me for a moment, because what you are about to understand is not a trick, nor some shallow charm. It is a deeper mechanism rooted in the unconscious patterns that govern attraction itself. In this reflection, you will begin to recognize how one subtle shift in your behavior changed the way they experienced you, how it awakened something primal, something they could not fully explain. And more importantly, you will begin to understand how this same force still lives inside you, waiting to be acknowledged and perhaps even mastered. There is something I need to tell you directly, and it may unsettle you. The version of yourself you worked so hard to become was never the version they were truly drawn toward. In fact, it was only when that performance started to crack, when the mask slipped even slightly, that something far more magnetic emerged. You see, most people move through life like actors on a stage, carefully rehearsing their lines, adjusting their expressions, searching for approval in subtle and desperate ways. Yet the psyche, especially the unconscious mind, possesses a remarkable sensitivity to what is genuine and what is merely constructed. The moment you stopped performing, even briefly, you interrupted that artificial pattern. You stepped outside the predictable script, and what replaced it was not perfection, not charm, not some polished ideal, but authenticity, raw and unfiltered presence. And whether you realize it or not, this is incredibly rare. Think about how often human beings alter themselves in the presence of others. A man changes his tone to appear stronger. A woman suppresses her opinions to seem more agreeable. A friend laughs at things they do not truly find amusing simply to preserve harmony. These are not deliberate deceptions in the traditional sense. They are adaptations developed over years, strategies designed to secure belonging. But beneath those adaptations exists a quiet tension, a disconnection between who someone truly is and who they pretend to be. Now imagine the moment you stopped doing this. Maybe you spoke without endlessly analyzing every word. Maybe you allowed silence instead of rushing to fill every gap. Maybe you revealed a thought, a flaw, or an opinion that did not fit the image you believed you had to maintain. In that instant, something shifted not only inside you, but inside them as well. Because when someone encounters a person who is no longer performing, it disrupts their expectations. It creates a kind of psychological tension. They can no longer place you neatly into familiar categories. You stop operating within the predictable patterns they are accustomed to navigating. And because of that, their attention sharpens, their curiosity deepens. They begin to sense there is something beneath the surface, something they cannot instantly understand. This is where fascination begins. You must understand that the human psyche is not drawn to perfection. It is drawn to wholeness. And wholeness includes contradiction, imperfection, vulnerability, and truth. When you allowed yourself to simply exist without embellishment, without excessive control, you revealed fragments of that wholeness. And in doing so, you offered them something they rarely encounter, a person who is no longer hiding. Imagine standing before a still lake. Most people constantly disturb the water with noise, performance, distraction, and effort. But when the surface becomes calm, When nothing is forced, the lake transforms into a mirror. It reflects with clarity. It invites depth. When you stopped performing, you became that stillness, and they, perhaps without fully understanding why, felt drawn to look closer. There is another dimension to this as well, one operating beneath conscious awareness. When you are constantly performing, you are seeking validation. You are silently asking the other person to confirm your worth. But the moment you stop performing, that silent request disappears. You are no longer asking, you are simply existing, and that changes the entire dynamic, because now they become the one leaning in. They become the one trying to understand, to connect, to close the emotional distance between you. What you must recognize is that attraction often grows not from what is openly given, but from what is allowed to be discovered. Imagine two conversations. In the first, you carefully choose every word, trying to impress, entertain, and maintain the other person's interest. In the second, you speak honestly. You pause when you genuinely have nothing to say. You allow moments of silence. You express thoughts that are sincere instead of strategic. Which conversation carries more life? Which one feels more real? The answer is not found in logic, but in human experience. The second creates space for authenticity to unfold. It invites presence instead of performance, and presence is where true connection begins. So I ask you to consider something deeply. How much of your life has been spent performing? How often have you shaped yourself according to what you imagined others expected from you? And what would happen if, even for a brief moment, you allowed that structure to collapse? Because the behavior that made you unforgettable was not something you added. It was something you removed. It was the absence of pretense, the courage, whether intentional or accidental, to stand as you are without endlessly adjusting yourself. And hidden inside that act is a quiet power, a power that does not demand attention but naturally attracts it, a power that does not seek approval because it no longer requires it. And once you begin to recognize this within yourself, you may realize that what you once believed was vulnerability was actually your greatest form of influence. There is another illusion many people live under, the belief that consistency in emotional expression will automatically make them more desirable, more secure, more worthy of being chosen. They believe that if they are always available, always warm, always predictable with their affection, attraction will naturally deepen. But this is not how the psyche responds to connection. The human mind is not captivated by what it can fully predict. It is stirred by what it cannot completely grasp. And when you became emotionally unpredictable, something fundamental changed between you and them. I do not mean chaos, manipulation, or emotional coldness. I mean that you stopped offering your inner world in a fixed, easily decoded pattern. You allowed your responses to emerge from something more genuine, more spontaneous, less controlled by the need to be liked. Neediness is not simply about wanting another person. It is about unconsciously handing them responsibility for your emotional state. It is the silent message that says, "My sense of self depends on how you respond to me." And whether spoken or unspoken, the other person senses this immediately. Imagine someone constantly checking their phone, waiting anxiously for a message. The moment it arrives, they respond instantly, almost automatically, filling every silence, maintaining constant contact, making sure there is no room for uncertainty. On the surface, this may appear like care or devotion, but underneath it often hides fear, fear of disconnection, fear of absence, fear of not being chosen. Now compare that to another kind of presence. Someone who engages, who listens, who expresses interest, but who does not cling. They respond when they genuinely have something meaningful to express. They retreat into their own world without panic. They are not rushing to secure the bond, nor are they pretending to be distant. They are simply not dependent. And this is where unpredictability naturally begins to appear, not as a calculated strategy, but as a byproduct of inner stability. When your emotional state is no longer tied entirely to another person's reactions, your behavior becomes less rigid and more alive. Not erratic, not confusing, but fluid. There is a rhythm to it, like waves moving through the ocean, sometimes near, sometimes distant, always shifting, never stagnant. And this rhythm creates intrigue because the unconscious mind is naturally drawn toward what feels alive. Predictability may create comfort, but mystery creates attention. When every response is immediate, every emotion obvious, every intention exposed, the mind stops searching. But when there is space, when there is emotional movement, when there is a sense that a person possesses an entire inner world beyond the interaction itself, fascination begins to grow. This is why the moment you stop centering your entire existence around their reactions, they started feeling your absence differently. They began to notice the spaces where your constant reassurance once existed. And in those spaces, curiosity emerged. You must understand something important. Emotional unpredictability does not mean playing games. It does not mean withholding affection to manipulate someone. The psyche can sense manipulation just as easily as it senses desperation. True unpredictability comes from authenticity. It comes from having a life, a mind, a purpose, and an emotional center that exists independently of another person's validation. When you stopped over-explaining yourself, stopped chasing reassurance, stopped trying to manage every perception they had of you, you became psychologically difficult to fully possess. And what cannot be fully possessed often becomes deeply compelling. The unconscious mind is endlessly attracted to depth. Not surface-level excitement, not temporary stimulation, but depth. And depth is created through contrast, through layers, through the realization that there is always more beneath what is immediately visible. When you became less performative and more grounded in yourself, you stopped behaving like someone asking to be chosen. You started behaving like someone who already belonged to themselves. And paradoxically, this is often the moment others begin wanting access to you more intensely. Because people are not only attracted to beauty or charm, they are attracted to emotional freedom. They are drawn toward individuals who are not desperately trying to secure love, because that energy feels expansive rather than consuming. Perhaps this is why they could suddenly feel your presence even in silence, why your absence began carrying more weight than your constant availability once did. Because when a person is no longer trying to force connection, the connection either dies naturally or becomes something far more real. And if it becomes real, it is no longer sustained by performance. It is sustained by truth, by emotional honesty, by the quiet confidence of someone who no longer bends themselves into impossible shapes just to avoid rejection. So maybe the reason they could not stop thinking about you was never because you became more impressive. Maybe it was because you became more real. Maybe the moment you stopped chasing was the moment they finally saw you clearly. Not the polished image, not the carefully controlled personality, but the living, breathing human being underneath it all. And that is the paradox most people spend their entire lives misunderstanding. The harder you try to force attraction, the more artificial your energy becomes. But the moment you return to yourself, the moment you stop performing and allow your presence to exist naturally, something ancient within the human psyche responds. Something instinctive, something impossible to fake. And the psyche is pulled toward this motion because anything that becomes fully predictable starts to disappear from awareness. It blends into the background of lived experience. But whatever changes, surprises, or slowly unfolds keeps attention alive. It stimulates curiosity. It draws engagement inward. Think about music. If every single note stayed the same, if rhythm never shifted or bent in any direction, interest would collapse almost instantly. It is variation, tension followed by release, and unexpected movement that holds you and allows feeling to arise. In the same way, you became that variation. When you stopped reacting in ways that were completely expected, you interrupted their internal model of who you are. They could no longer rely on assumptions about how you would respond, what you might say, or how you would feel. Within that uncertainty, their mind had to engage more actively. They started thinking about you more, analyzing patterns, anticipating responses, and wondering what comes next. This is not a manipulation tactic, it is a psychological reality. However, this is where many people misunderstand the principle and turn it into performance again. They try to artificially create unpredictability. They delay replies on purpose, suppress emotions deliberately, or create distance as a calculated move. In doing so, they fall back into the same trap they were trying to escape. It simply becomes another role they are acting out. Real unpredictability cannot be manufactured. It only emerges when there is no longer a need to control outcomes or manage perception. Consider a simple moment in real life. You are talking to someone you feel drawn toward. Earlier, you might have carefully selected your words, trying to preserve a certain image. But now, something has shifted. You allow yourself to speak more naturally. At times you are light and playful, at other times reflective or even quiet. You do not force consistency. You let your emotional state move as it is. That person begins to feel it. They notice you are not locked into one fixed version of yourself, not reduced to something easily predicted. There is depth, movement, and something unfolding that cannot be fully mapped. This draws them in, because the mind always leans toward what it cannot fully define. It tries to resolve uncertainty, to explore what is not yet understood. But the deeper truth is that your power was never simply unpredictability itself. It came from the absence of neediness that made unpredictability possible. When you are no longer dependent on reassurance, when fear of loss no longer governs your behavior, when your sense of self does not collapse based on someone else's response, something inside you becomes free. From that freedom, your actions stop being rigid. They become fluid, responsive, and alive. So it becomes important to ask where in your life you are still trying to secure certainty through control. Where are you still shaping yourself into a fixed version just to be liked, chosen, or desired? And what would happen if you loosened that grip even slightly? Because the moment you no longer need to be predictable is often the moment you become hardest to ignore. There is a phenomenon within human psychology that most people experience but rarely understand. It is that strange sensation of being understood without having fully revealed yourself. As if someone has quietly stepped into your inner world and reflected back something you had not fully articulated, maybe not even consciously recognized. When this happens, the effect is powerful and magnetic. Much of human desire does not originate in conscious thought. It is shaped in deeper layers of the mind, formed by unconscious material, forgotten emotional patterns, unmet needs, and parts of the self that remain unintegrated. These elements do not speak clearly. They do not announce themselves directly. Instead, they show up through feeling, projection, and subtle longing that seeks recognition. This is where you, often without intention, become significant in someone's inner world. When you reflect back aspects of their unconscious experience, you act like a mirror, not a surface reflection that only shows appearance, but a deeper one that reveals what lies underneath. You are not just responding to what they say, but to what they feel, without knowing how to express it. In ordinary interaction, most people listen only at the surface level. They respond to words with agreement, advice, or polite replies. But sometimes you notice something else: a hesitation in tone, a shift in expression, an emotion that does not fully match what is being said. And instead of ignoring it, you respond to that deeper layer. In that moment, the person feels seen in a different way. Not for the role they are presenting, but for something more truthful beneath it. This is where projection becomes important. The mind constantly tries to become whole by projecting unrecognized parts of itself onto others. It searches outwardly for what it cannot yet fully see within itself. When it finds someone who seems to carry or reflect those hidden qualities, fascination begins to form. In that sense, you become a vessel for projection, not because you intentionally created an image, but because something in your presence resonated with what they were unconsciously seeking. Perhaps you expressed a kind of freedom they had suppressed. Perhaps you showed emotional depth they had not yet explored. Perhaps you carried a grounded calm that contrasted with their inner instability. Whatever the form, something essential was reflected back. Imagine someone moving through a dim internal landscape, sensing there is more to them than what they currently understand. Then they encounter a presence that seems to illuminate part of that inner space, not by explaining it, not by analyzing it, but simply by being there. Something inside them begins to organize, to take shape. This is not surface attraction. It is the psyche moving toward integration, toward a sense of wholeness. But there is a caution embedded in this dynamic. To reflect someone's unconscious material is not the same as fulfilling it. You are not responsible for resolving their inner conflicts. You are only reflecting what already exists within them. If they are not ready to face that reflection, they may become attached not to you, but to the image they have projected onto you. And this is where confusion begins. Many people get caught here. They start identifying with the version of themselves that others see in them. They feel pressure to maintain it, protect it, and perform it. Slowly, they drift away from their authentic state and become shaped by expectation rather than truth. That is why awareness is essential. What others see in you is partly a projection of their own inner world. You did not create it. You revealed it. And your responsibility is not to carry their projection, but to remain anchored in yourself. Think of a moment when someone told you they feel understood by you. Often, you may not even fully grasp what they mean. You were simply present, listening without distortion. Yet for them, something internal opened. A hidden space became visible. That is the moment of impact. Not because you tried to impress, but because you made something real within them visible again. The deepest connections are not formed by giving people something entirely new. They are formed when you help them recognize something that was already there, but not yet seen clearly. So the question becomes whether you are truly perceiving others or only interacting with the surface they show. Whether you are hearing only words or sensing what exists underneath them. As this awareness deepens, something subtle begins to happen. Your presence alone starts to activate something in others, something they cannot easily describe, yet cannot ignore either. And in that quiet exchange, it becomes clear that what makes you significant is not what you display to them, but what you allow them to discover within themselves.